What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Krusty Christy. In this video is a serious video. It's not a funny video at all. She saw popes in hell. This is what they confessed. This is a Second Chance YouTube channel where people die and they go to hell and they come back, or they die and they go to heaven and they come back. Heaven and hell is real, people. Heaven and hell is real. I swear on my life. I swear on my life. And there's the sad thing is there's so many sins that people take for granted that they think are minor. They will send you to hell. It's just, I just hope people repent and read the Bible, 10 Commandments. I'm not saying you have to go to church every Sunday, it would help, but anyways, she saw popes in hell. This is what they confessed.
God's mercy be upon you. In the new episode of Second Chances, I'll be sharing the testimony of a sister who witnessed with her own eyes the sins that led the popes to hell. What she saw will be a profound lesson for all of us. On the morning of September 9th, 2023, I woke up in my home in Cincinnati. I had a slight headache, but I didn't take it too seriously. I continued with my daily tasks, but the pain began to worsen. My eyes were getting heavy, and my breathing became irregular. On that day, which I thought was perfectly normal, I had no idea I was approaching the biggest turning point of my life. My husband was watching me with concern. "We need to call a doctor," he said. At first I objected, but my headache quickly became unbearable. The doctor arrived.
Flexibility is the embodiment of youthfulness. How old do you think I am? Would you guess that I'm 40?
Good for you. I don't know.
Gave me an injection and told me I needed to rest. I lay down on the bed, wanting nothing more than to sleep a little as my eyes closed. But there was a strange feeling inside me, as if something was unsettling me from within. After a while my eyes were closed, I felt my room fill with an incredible light. I wanted to open my eyes, but I couldn't. Then I realized that my body was still lying on the bed, but my soul had separated from it. When I became aware that I had left my body, I first felt great confusion. As I lay motionless on my bed, I tried to understand how my soul could be so light. On one hand, I was looking around, and on the other, I was trying to figure out what was happening to me. Everything was silent, yet it was also so full. I was wavering between peace and fear. Then, suddenly, two bright figures appeared in the room. At first, I couldn't understand what they were, but as they approached, I realized they were angels. Dressed in pure white garments with radiant faces, they appeared beside me. They watched me, but they didn't say a word. At that moment, the only thing passing through my heart was the question, "What's happening?" One of them approached me and said in a clear voice, "Maria, get up. We have places to go." At that moment, I showed no resistance, because a deep sense of trust formed within me. I began to follow them. Moving with the lightness that comes from leaving the body, I didn't know where I was going with the angels, It felt like a long journey, but I had no sense of time. After a while, a large black door appeared before us. The door was so enormous and terrifying that instinctively I wanted to pull back, but the angels watched me with calming gazes. Behind the door was something very frightening. One of the angels reached out and slowly opened the door. At that moment, a completely different world unfolded before my eyes. As we stepped inside, the heat suddenly struck my face. I felt the air was so thick and suffocating that it was as if breathing was impossible. Flames were everywhere, but this was not ordinary fire. Every spark seemed to move like it was alive. The sky was dark and filled with dense smoke, but the worst were the sounds. Screams filled with pain and regret echoed in my ears. People were writhing in agony, but their faces showed not only physical pain, but also deep spiritual remorse. As the angels took me deeper into hell, I realized how eternal everything was here. There was no light of hope. People burned in the flames, while monstrous, shapeless creatures roamed mercilessly around them, each one waiting to torture. Some people were being dragged into bottomless pits that looked like endless falls, while others were being torn apart by giant creatures. These scenes were unimaginably horrifying. As the angels continued to show me these horrors, they said, "This is the final destination for those who are far from God. This is the place for those who cannot escape the consequences of their sins." Every soul's face bore the remorse of past mistakes, but for them it was already too late. As our journey progressed, we encountered other suffering souls, each with different sins and facing various tortures. These people were lost here, and salvation was no longer possible for them. As we ventured deeper into hell, a new figure appeared before us. The angels said, "The first person you will see here was known to the world." As we descended further into the depths of hell, the surrounding pains intensified. Screams intertwined. The smell of burning flesh and bottomless darkness had seeped into me. Looking around in fear,
Out of all the videos I've watched, all the testimonies of people who went to hell, they all say the same thing about that. The smell of burning flesh. The smell of burning flesh. I can't get that out of my senses, my mind. I can still smell it like it was just 5 minutes ago. The smell of burning flesh. Well, I mean, it's hell, so.
I noticed a crowd. As I moved closer, a distinct figure caught my attention. A soul, kneeling on their knees, hands covering their face, constantly crying and suffering. The deep remorse and fear on their face sent chills down my spine. As I approached, I recognized who it was, the world-renowned Pope John Paul II. Pope's tears never ceased, but it wasn't just physical pain. His soul bore a...
I'm trying to think which popes were around during the child sex scandal. Of priests, it all coming out of priests having sex with boys, little boys. Who were, now men grown up, and all of these, like, hundreds of men came forward saying that they were sexually abused by priests when they were altar boys or working in the church, helping with the church. Trying to think which popes were around during that. Because there were a lot of cover-ups. I mean, I've heard, stories of people who went to hell and saw priests in hell. Which is, like, duh. Just because you're a priest doesn't mean you can just rape innocent children and you'll go to heaven because you serve God. No, you're going to punish. You're going to hell. You're a human being first before whatever your occupation is. You may have served God, but you did something that is despicable. And I know there's a lot of cover-up, so I'm wondering, I can't remember what popes were around during the... But you know what? I think there have been cover-ups long before any of the press came out. Like over, I don't know, 100 years, 150 years. That's just my opinion, but...
A greater burden. I felt a desire to understand the reason behind his suffering. The angels remained silent. I just knew I had to watch. At that moment, I felt the presence of Jesus. He slowly approached me and continued to watch the scene unfolding before my eyes. Pope John Paul II was surrounded by approaching souls. These souls were victims of abuse. Their pain was evident on their...
Are you looking for an honest and legit way to supplement your income? If that's you, then pick the Lindmer.
faces.
Sorry.
They circled around the Pope, looking at him with eyes full of torment. Each had deep sorrow and remorse on their faces. The Pope seemed even more diminished by the weight of not being able to help them. He was crying out, but no one heard his voice. Each scream was like a cry, echoing the inner pains of the souls.
That's another thing I've heard. People who went to hell and came back. You know, they've seen people like scream, but it's like you couldn't hear them. Not everyone, but some. So that's interesting. But yeah, for eternity, he must have been a pope that was around during the sex scandal, child sex church scandal. And his eternity is every day having the same thing. The souls. Now those souls may or may not be people that ended up going to hell themselves. I mean, just because you're raped, you could go on and rape or kill someone or commit adultery so maybe they're in hell and their souls are tormenting the Pope, who's also in hell. Or maybe they're souls that are from heaven and just torment the Pope. That's what they're supposed to do. I don't know. It's eternal.
At that moment, Jesus began to speak in a gentle yet. They circled around the Pope, looking at him with eyes full of torment. Each had deep sorrow and remorse on their faces. the Pope seemed even more diminished by the weight of not being able to help them. He was crying out, but no one heard his voice.
He had a chance
Each
to.
scream was like a cry, echoing the inner pains of the souls. At that moment,
He had a chance to help them when he was alive and the leader of the church. But he chose to cover it up, and
Jesus began to speak in a gentle yet heavy voice. This person was recognized as God's messenger in the world. Hundreds of people trusted him and took refuge in the church's safe arms, but he failed to protect the most vulnerable. His neglect of the sexual abuse scandals, the church's dark secrets he tried to cover up, are costing him dearly here. Pope's agony was increasing. Watching him, I felt the depth of his pain intensify with each passing moment. Jesus reached out his hand, and the ghosts of abuse victims continued to swirl around the Pope. They could no longer find salvation,
I love it.
and because of the Pope's inadequate intervention, they were suffering even more. The remorse on the Pope's face stemmed not only from his earthly mistakes, but also from his failure to help innocent souls sufficiently. Pope's punishment was like an eternal cycle. Every moment, he relived the same pain, confronting the same remorse.
Like Groundhog's Day.
As the souls of the victims circled around him, each looked at him with silent pleas for accountability. Every step he took, every breath he made, seemed to be crushed under the weight of this heavy burden. Jesus added, he not only took responsibility for bodies, but also for souls. But he did not fulfill this responsibility. Jesus said to Pope John Paul II, you were loved and seen as holy by many in the world, but in God's eyes, the protection of each innocent is above all. You remain silent to protect the Church's reputation. This silence, this indifference, condemns you to eternal punishment here. The Pope tried to cover his face with his hands, but his tears never stopped. At that moment, the souls of the abuse victims reached out to his hands, gently pulling him and reminding him that he was the cause of their suffering. This scene was so filled with intense remorse that even breathing became difficult. Every line on the Pope's face reflected his inner struggles and the sorrow deep within his soul. Jesus turned to me and spoke softly. Such mistakes are unforgivable in God's eyes. He should have been aware of his responsibilities. The protection of the innocent is paramount. Even though his position was highly regarded by the people, here justice is served. Pope John Paul II's pain would never end. He would continue to suffer the consequences of the Church's ignored mistakes and silence. Confronting the victims of abuse was his eternal torment. Hell was not only a place of physical pain, but also the center of spiritual agony. Here, I understood how justice was served, and nothing remained hidden in God's eyes. Watching this scene was very difficult for me, but it also made me realize an inevitable truth. Every soul had to account for the sins they committed, no matter how sacred they were considered in the world. Pope John Paul II's eternal suffering was both a warning to the faithful in the world and a demonstration of the strength of God's justice. The angels turned to me.
It doesn't matter who you are on earth, past and present. Doesn't matter. It means nothing. When you die, everyone is equal. It's just a matter of you going to heaven, you going to hell. What did you do when you were on planet Earth living? Were you living in sin? One of the sins that people don't realize is thou shalt forgive thy enemies. There have been so many people, I'm a true crime fan, so many people who have had their sons and daughters murdered, and in court, after the killer is found guilty, they speak, you can talk, court allows you to talk to the killer. There's so many, not a lot, there should be more, but there's so many that have said, we forgive you. Because in the Bible, God says, forgive thy enemies. Could you do that? I don't know if I could. But I would. Because I don't want to go to hell. But it's not just people who kill, you know. You have to forgive the people that, if you were raped or molested, you have to forgive them. They'll be punished when they die. Don't you worry. Forgive all of your enemies. You have to forgive all of them, no matter what they did to you. They will be punished. I promise you, they will be punished. But you have to forgive them. Watch out for your soul. Your soul. Concentrate on you. Concentrate on you and your soul. Just always remember, just because you forgive them, that's your soul, and their soul is going to be punished. I promise you. Forgive thy enemies.
And said, but it also made me...
It's here. This is it. The federal government just come out with some new regulations that allow
Really?
real estate.
Really?
Let's
Why are you in the water?
me realize an inevitable truth. Every soul had to account for the sins they committed, no matter how sacred they were considered in the world. Pope John Paul II's eternal suffering was both a warning to the faithful in the world and a demonstration of the strength of God's justice. The angels turned to me and said, what you have seen is just the beginning. You need to learn more. My journey in hell continued, and next there was another famous soul waiting. The angels guided me to another place surrounded by dark and thick fog. The atmosphere was much heavier than the souls I had seen before. It was as if this dark fog was a reflection of the deep remorse and neglected responsibilities of the suffering souls here. The density of the air pressed into me with every breath. Through the mist, a figure appeared. I immediately recognized him. Pope Benedict XVI was kneeling, his hands covering his face with snakes coiling around him. The screams and murmurs around him echoed continuously. These sounds were like echoes of the past, the cries he ignored and silenced. Each scream carried a burden that weighed heavily on me. Seeing Benedict surrounded by such deep pain caused a great turmoil within me. Seeing him in such remorse showed how he had avoided responsibilities during his papacy. Jesus slowly approached me and clarified the scene beside Benedict in front of my eyes. This scene, like the punishment Pope John Paul II faced, was filled with the pains of abuse victims. However, Benedict's punishment was more complicated. He was not only facing the sins he ignored, but also the remorse of abandoning his papacy. Jesus looked at Pope Benedict with deep sorrow. He held the highest position in the church, yet saw evil and remained silent. Instead of confronting the abuse scandals, he chose to cover them up. When the burden became too much, he fled, abandoning his responsibility. Benedict covered his ears, but the victim's screams grew louder.
Yeah, he was the first pope ever to step down as pope. Every other pope there's ever been died as pope. He was the first ever pope to step down. So not only did he cover up scandals, but he was like, I'm gonna resign, I'm out of here. Yeah, that's ooh, yeah, not good.
Piercing through his soul, the weight of his silence and neglect tormented him.
To any of you that are tired, you hate police officers who covered up things and then resigned, they go to hell. I promise you. Cover up, scandals, briberies throughout their, like the chief of police or police officer who did bad stuff. But any of you people that are just sick and tired and you hate the police for getting away, they're able to resign and stuff, they're going to hell. They, took bribes, accepted payments, money, were racist, and they resigned. They're going to hell and are in hell, the ones who have died.
Every scream was a reminder of his failure to act. Dark clouds of remorse surrounded him, deepening his agony as the victims' souls reached for him, demanding justice. Jesus turned to me and said, his resignation wasn't just an escape. It deepened the church's suffering. Financial scandals and corruption thrived under his silence. We descended further into hell. The air thickened, pain intensified. Before me loomed a massive, terrifying throne. Satan himself sat there. The most terrifying place in hell awaited. At that moment, a chill enveloped my entire body. Satan, with his massive form, seated on his throne, his eyes glittering and a frightening smile, watching everything around him. He had summoned both popes, Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, who were kneeling and writhing in remorse. Satan seemed to have bound them with invisible chains, enjoying their suffering. Satan approached Pope Benedict and began to speak in a mocking voice. Ah, Benedict, you were once a great leader of the church, weren't you? But your silence, your fears, your escapes have brought you here. Now you have nowhere to run. Satan's voice echoed as the flames of hell flared brighter and the screams rose higher. Benedict tried to cover his face with his hands, but there was no escape from this torture. Satan then turned to Pope John Paul II. You are here too, John Paul. You may be holy in the eyes of the people, but here the truths come to light. You thought you were uniting the church, but by covering up the abuses and turning away your close ones, you are now being punished with eternal torment. Satan's voice plunged John Paul II's soul deeper into agony. He felt the weight of his punishment increasing with every passing second. At that moment, Satan turned to me. His cold gaze froze me inside. You're curious, aren't you? He said. These two great leaders are here, but the last one has not yet arrived. His eyes sparkled with a devilish smile as he spread across his face. Pope Francis, ah yes, his time is approaching. A shiver ran through me. Pope Francis, the current pope, known for his modern reforms, was Satan saying that he would come to hell. Satan laughed mockingly as he straightened on his throne. Pope Francis, you are trying to modernize the church. You offer reforms that people will like, comforting changes. But these reforms go against God's rules. You bowed to the demands of the modern world. By softening the church, you left the believers' souls defenseless, he said. His eyes sparkled with a satanic glimmer before he added, "You think you are guiding people to the right path by touching them, but in reality, you are dragging them to hell. Every reform weakens the church's foundation." Satan declared that Pope Francis would soon come to hell. His voice was filled with mockery and pleasure. Francis's reforms corrupted the church. Under him, many souls have drifted away from God. He will come here soon, very soon.
That is true. I've heard over the last 5 years, more and more people are leaving the church, turning to Judaism and Buddhism, I don't know, are becoming atheists, and we don't need to get started on the atheists and people who don't believe in God going to hell. We don't. If you see my other 2 videos, yeah, and I've seen more videos, I just haven't posted them. I should. If you're an atheist and you don't believe in God, especially if you mock him, you're going to hell. We've had people die who were atheists or didn't believe in God, and they went to hell and they came back, and they're now Christians. They go to church. They've lost, a lot of friends who are what? There is no God. You're just crazy. Whatever, you're just crazy. Guess they're gonna have to find out for themselves. That's all you can do.
And his punishment will be greater than the previous ones. Satan's words echoed in the depths of hell. Pope Francis's future punishment in hell had been declared. Satan viewed Francis's softening of the church and his attempts to adapt God's rules to worldly norms as a grave sin. Ah, Francis, your reforms have crumbled the structure of the church. People trusted you because you made them comfortable. But the truth is not in comfort. The truth is on God's difficult paths. You dragged them to hell, the easy way. These words caused a great turmoil within me. Satan's statements were not only mocking, but also frighteningly realistic. He was claiming that Pope Francis's reforms had opened a gate to hell, endangering people's souls. And as a result of these reforms, Francis himself would face severe punishment in hell.
I will say this. Years and years ago, when he was younger, Pope Francis had ties, some friends that were in the mafia. I heard that years ago. 10 years ago. That Pope Francis, when he was younger, had friends that were in the mafia. So I don't know. Maybe that's one of the reasons that he's going to get it worse than these other 2 popes. Maybe he didn't do anything with the mafia. I don't. He's going to get it worse, I guess.
Satan's dark and threatening words still echoed in my mind. Learning that Pope Benedict XVI, Pope John Paul II, and Pope Francis would come to hell created a deep burden within me. But at that moment, even in the darkest corners of hell, a light appeared, a bright, peaceful light. This light spread like a force that cleansed everything, and Satan's mocking laughter suddenly ceased. As I closed my eyes and turned towards the light, I felt Jesus' presence. His warm, loving presence created a great sense of peace within me. Satan's terrifying gaze and the horrifying scenes of hell vanished beneath this brightness. Jesus stepped towards Satan's throne. For a moment, the prideful expression on Satan's face seemed to fade. Even Jesus' presence made him tremble. Then Jesus turned to me and spoke in a gentle voice. "Maria, what you have seen is true, but you must also learn lessons from these truths." Jesus extended his hands towards Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II. Both of them trembled slightly as they lifted their heads. Jesus' presence revealed their deep remorse. Jesus leaned over them and began to speak gently, but with deep seriousness. "You were leaders of the church, but you made great mistakes. Your silences, your escapes from leadership harmed God's house. You did not fulfill your responsibilities, and now you are feeling the weight of that." Then Jesus whispered a verse from the Bible. Luke 17:2. "It would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a millstone around their neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble." These words created even deeper remorse and pain in the eyes of Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II. They had failed to prevent the abuse that harmed the most vulnerable in the Church and had remained silent. Jesus turned to Pope Benedict and reminded him of James 4:17. "If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." These words were about Pope Benedict's resignation and abandonment of responsibility. Jesus reminded him of the great responsibility he was given and how he failed to fulfill it. Turning to Pope John Paul II, Jesus read a verse from Matthew.
What if your smile could go from looking like this
It
to
can't.
this? Would you be more
It
confident?
can't.
23:27 to 28. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean." Jesus pointed out that Pope John Paul II was seen as a holy figure externally, but internally covered up the evils within the Church. Jesus used these verses to remind them of the spiritual consequences of their actions, not just the earthly ones. The cries of the abuse victims exposed their internal collapse. He emphasized that they needed to confront not only their silence, but also the evils they had ignored. Then Jesus placed his hands on their heads. "You were seen as great leaders in the world, but in God's kingdom, leadership comes with responsibility, and you did not carry out this responsibility." At that moment, the remorse on Pope Benedict and John Paul II's faces deepened. They trembled under Jesus' hands, but also felt the purifying effect of this remorse. Jesus turned to me and reminded me of the same verses. "As you have seen, everything people do and do not do is clear in God's eyes. The world may see them as holy, but the truth is always revealed in God's eyes." At that moment, Jesus seemed to be giving me a message to convey to the faithful in the world. Then Jesus began to lift Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II upward. They had confronted their sins, drowning in the depths of hell's flames, while seeing a glimmer of hope in Jesus' hands. I didn't know if they would be completely saved, but I felt that Jesus was guiding them to face their sins and correct what they had learned in this world on another level. Finally, Jesus turned to me and said, "Anyone who is a leader guiding others has the greatest duty to bear their responsibilities, and every leader must answer to God's justice. These words were a lesson to me. Everyone in the world, especially leaders, would be held accountable in God's eyes. As Jesus lifted them upward, he shone like a beam of light through the darkness of hell. Satan's influence diminished, and the dark landscapes of hell shrank under Jesus' light. Satan seemed to retreat, but his mocking gaze still suggested he would take pleasure in future downfalls. Jesus finally reminded me that God's justice would always prevail. He said that no leader or person on earth could escape scrutiny. His justice ruled not only in the world, but also in eternity. As Jesus pulled me up from the dark corners of hell, I felt a great sense of peace within me. His presence embraced me, and those horrific scenes began to disappear, one by one. I closed my eyes, and Jesus' shining light dispersed all darkness. My soul felt lighter, but the weight of everything I had seen echoed in my mind. In an instant, I found myself back in my body. When I opened my eyes, familiar faces were around me, my husband Herbert and my children standing anxiously by my bedside. Everything was so surreal that even being back in my body felt like a dream. But I knew that what I had experienced was not just a dream or imagination. Everything I saw had left deep imprints on my soul. My breathing was irregular, but there was a great awareness in my heart. Jesus' words echoed in my mind. Every leader must answer to God's justice. I also needed to reevaluate my own life and responsibilities. I had to learn not only to live in the world, but also to remain faithful to God's path.
That's the end of that video. 42 minutes. I'm sorry the video's so long. I hate making long videos. But yeah, please just don't sin. Apologize for all your sins. Talk about them to God. Apologize. Repent. Just repent. I don't want to see any of you in hell. I don't mean like me personally see you. I mean, I have sinned. I've never murdered or raped, anything like that, but I have sinned and I've apologized so many times. And I will apologize to the day I die. I forgive all my enemies, God. I forgive every single one of the people that have hurt me. Anyways, love you all, like always and forever. Take care, be safe, peace.